Hello everyone out there in cyberspace. This is YSI presenting a live Q&A session and a follow-up to an algae webinar that took place 2 weeks ago. I'm Zach Henderson, this is Stephanie Smith, and we're here to answer any questions you might have about harmful algal blooms or algae sensor technology. With that, I'll hand it over to Stephanie.
Hi, thanks Zach. I want to thank everybody that attended our webinar on April 26th. In case you missed it, the webinar is posted on our website and on YSI's YouTube channel. We had such great attendance at the webinar that we got more questions than we could answer. And some of those questions we've already followed up with you on, but we had a handful more that we thought we'd try to answer today, and we wanted to give you, our live viewers, the opportunity to just send us your questions. While we get started on some of those questions, if you want to just let us know what systems you're using or what systems you're interested in, whether it's EXO or ProDSS, you can go ahead and type that in. And if you have questions about the algae sensors on ProDSS, which is a new thing, ask us about it. So Zach, why don't we take a look at some of the questions that we didn't have time to get to last week, or 2 weeks ago, I guess.
Well, let me preface by saying how this is going to work. Again, this is a live event, a Facebook Live event, which is still kind of new to us, so if there's any technical hiccups or anything, we thank you for your patience. But feel free to submit questions in the comments section of the feed. I'll be monitoring those, so if you occasionally see me looking down and not looking at you guys on the camera, it's because I'm reading questions and trying to write those down as they come in. Looks like we're a little bit slow to start here, so we do have some questions that were submitted in advance that we can go ahead and get this conversation starting. Although it does appear we are getting comments come in. We got a hello from
Great.
Amber Botkin, so
Thank you, Amber.
Yeah. But down to the actual questions here. So one of the questions that came in after the webinar, Stephanie, was if chlorophyll and phycocyanin channels both measure emissions. Now this is getting into really technical guts of the sensors here. So if the chlorophyll and phycocyanin channels on the EXO algae sensor both measure emissions at 685 nanometer wavelengths, how does this sensor differentiate between the two?
That's a really good question. So in the webinar last week, I talked about how the sensor has two LEDs for emission, where one LED excites phycocyanin and the other LED excites chlorophyll directly, but there's only one detector in the sensor, and that detector is only detecting a single wavelength of light that effectively is coming through chlorophyll. So that's a principle that if you want to learn more about that, you can go to the webinar to pick up those details. But then the question is, well, if you're only detecting one wavelength of light, how do you know if that came when you excited phycocyanin or when you excited chlorophyll? So the way you figure that out is the channels, the LEDs themselves that do the pigment excitation, they aren't on at the same time. So they are rapidly firing at different times. So the sensor itself has an algorithm to kind of deconvolute those data as they are coming in. So it knows when it's detecting light, that 685 nanometer light, it knows if that light was emitted due to excitation from the phycocyanin LED or excitation that was due to the chlorophyll LED. So it has to do with the engineering and the really the firmware and the algorithms in the sensor that help make that distinction.
Great, thank you for that wonderful explanation, Stephanie. Another question that came in after the webinar was from Alex. He says, I have monitoring stations in a coastal estuary and freshwater locations. Is it appropriate to use phycoerythrin sensor for both?
So that's another great question, and I think you all should give Zach a lot of kudos for properly pronouncing
Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes,
oh,
you
wonderful.
did a great job. If you guys don't know why I'm teasing him about that, you should look at our little video online about about the total algae sensors, where we kind of do a little spoof on the pronunciation of phycoerythrin. But thank you for that question, and it's actually, it's kind of an interesting question. It's one we hear a lot because it can be a little confusing which sensor you should use at which time. So for those of you that might be new to the algae sensors, let me just give you a little background first. There are two types of total algae sensors. Both of those sensors have a channel for chlorophyll, but one of those sensors has a channel for phycocyanin, and the other one of those sensors has a channel for phycoerythrin. So we call that the total algae PC sensor versus the total algae PE sensor. And kind of the rule of thumb has always been, if you're working in freshwater, you would use the total algae phycocyanin sensor. And if you're working in a coastal or marine environment, you would use the total algae phycoerythrin sensor. So if you know nothing else about the algae you're looking for, that's kind of the rule that you follow. Now, there are definitely exceptions to that, though. For example, sometimes people working in the Gulf of Mexico or Monterey Bay or other coastal bays might actually be monitoring for freshwater incursions into those systems. So they're looking for the kinds of algae that would be introduced from a freshwater system. So even though they're in a coastal system, they might be better off using that phycocyanin sensor. I can't think of any scenario, though, where you would use the phycoerythrin sensor for going into a freshwater system. Sure. So in your coastal systems, really you might use either sensor. In your freshwater system, you're probably going to want to stick with the phycocyanin sensor.
Okay.
So that's a great question. Thank you for sending it in.
Yeah. All right. And looks like we're getting some viewers here. It looks like we have about 10 people out there watching. So
great.
hello.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Just a reminder, this is a live Q&A event from YSI as a follow-up to our algae webinar we had a couple weeks ago. So feel free to submit any algae-related questions in the comments section. We'll do our best to answer those. So I'm monitoring the comments as they come in. We have one comment from Amy. What is the relationship between the concentration of PE or PC and toxicity of water?
That's a really good question. So to again give you a little bit of background there, some algal blooms are dominated by algae that produce toxins. If you're in a coastal environment and you're used to red tides, that might be brevetoxin or saxitoxin. If you're in a freshwater environment like we have plenty of here in Ohio, typically you're talking about microcystin toxins that are made by Microcystis aeruginosa. So really, a lot of people who are monitoring for algae, they really don't care so much about the algae, they care about those toxins. The challenge is the sensors are not detecting toxins. The sensors are detecting pigments that are in some of those algae. So the short answer is the sensor is not a direct surrogate measurement for toxins. With that said, we do know, and there are some very nice papers that have been published on Lake Erie, for example, and some folks at Ohio State have done some good studies in beach monitoring. I think Jiyoung Lee at Ohio State has published some nice papers on this. When you have blooms like we do in Lake Erie, which are dominated by Microcystis aeruginosa, sometimes you can get very nice correlations between detection of pigment and then follow-up detection of toxin when you use something like an ELISA, for example, for detecting the toxin. Those correlations don't always hold up, though, so I always caution people about using the sensor as a surrogate measurement for toxin. In some systems, it's a very tight, predictable relationship. In other systems, sometimes it holds up, and then there are systems where it never holds up. So you kind of have to establish that baseline understanding for your system to decide if the sensor is going to help you do that.
explanation,
Thanks, Zach.
Stephanie. Absolutely. Okay, so we have a question that just came in from our good friend Kirk Butler. He asks, if we have both PE and PC sensors installed on the same sonde, will they interfere with each other?
That is a really good question, and to our knowledge, we have never seen that type of interference. And theoretically, it shouldn't happen because the way the sensors are firing at different times and the way the detector works, you shouldn't see that type of interference. And in fact, we've had people who on occasion have wanted to use both a PE and a PC sensor, a total algae phycocyanin and a total algae phycoerythrin sensor at the same time to help them decide which sensor is going to be more useful. So earlier in our conversation, we were talking about how it's not always easy to know which of those sensors you should be using, particularly in a coastal or marine environment. Occasionally your friendly salesperson can loan you one or the other to help you figure that out. And in cases where we've done that side by side, we haven't seen issues with interference.
So I guess I have a question. If somebody did have both the phycocyanin and phycoerythrin sensors loaded on the same sonde, both those sensors are dual channel sensors, meaning they measure chlorophyll and the algae pigment. Since both of those sensors measure chlorophyll, would they expect to see the exact same chlorophyll readings coming from each sensor?
That's a really great question. And I would expect they should be very, very close. There are always, and this is a classic problem in science in general because it's about sampling, right? And each of these sensors is really sampling a microenvironment right around the face of that sensor. So technically, there could be differences in that, but at a gross level, there really shouldn't be big differences in that. One thing I will say, though, is if you do see big differences, if you had two sensors side by side and you were seeing big differences in the chlorophyll measurement, I would be highly suspect about whether those sensors were properly calibrated. That's one of the reasons that we do secondary calibration with rhodamine, is so that your sensors, whether they're on the same sonde or on different sondes in different environments or on your ProDSS, those sensors should be able to give you very, very similar data for the same, certainly microenvironment, if not larger environment, if they're properly calibrated.
Gotcha.
So that was a really great question, Zach.
Awesome, and thank you, Kurt, for that question. So it looks like we have about 11 people watching us live right now. Hello out there.
Hi.
Again, just a reminder for those tuning in, this is a live Facebook Q&A session and follow-up to our algae webinar. So again, don't be shy out there. Feel free to submit your algae questions or comments. We'll take comments too. Any questions or comments you have about algae or sensor technology used to measure algae. We did have a question that was submitted in advance by John. John must be a 6 Series user on the 6 Series sonde platform because he's asking, why can't EXO provide a cells per milliliter unit?
Yes, and this is a question that we've been asked by a lot of our 6 Series users. So just to provide a little background again, the 6 Series platform that predates the EXO platform is an older sonde platform, and it didn't have total algae sensors the way we do on the EXO platform. There was an individual chlorophyll sensor, an individual phycocyanin sensor, and an individual phycoerythrin sensor. And especially on that chlorophyll sensor, people like to get cells per mil or cells per liter reads off of that sensor. And the way that was implemented was years ago, we grew laboratory cultures of either Cenodesmus or blue-green algae like Microcystis, and then we would measure the fluorescence units detected by the sensor in those cultures, and then we would take those exact same samples and go do a cell count by microscopy. And we used that to build correlations. And we programmed those relationships into the sensor. And when people would use that sensor, they could tell the SON they wanted their units delivered in cells per mil. And it was very popular. What we started to notice, though, and this won't surprise anybody who works in the lab, what happens in the lab doesn't always translate to the real world.
Right.
And so what happens in a pure culture of centidecimus for that relationship can be a very poor correlation for what happens in a red tide or a brown tide situation where you have totally different algae involved. So as we started to notice, that was really, frankly, it was causing more problems than it was worth in some cases, and we really decided that the science wasn't as sound behind that as we like things to be. So we've come up with a couple of different ways to deal with that. What we did initially with EXO is we just got rid of that unit. But there are people who really needed that unit and whose regulatory environment, for example, requires that unit. So one of the things that's coming up, we're actually going to be releasing a new version of core software. Zach has been leading a lot of the charge on that and helping us get that software ready. There's going to be a new drop of core software in June, and that drop of the software will actually have a module where you can build your own cells per mil relationship. So you can do what we did. You can grab a sample out of the environment instead of grow it in the lab, measure it with the sonde, then take it to your scope or plate it or use whatever method you want and collect your cell per mil points. And there will be a module where you can enter your relative fluorescent unit data from the sonde and your CFU data or cells per mil data from your lab analysis. And then you can tell the sonde, use this relationship to deliver all of my data in cells per mil. So that's a new capability that will be available in June in the core software. There's one other thing we did for those diehard 6 series users.
Like you, John.
Like you, John. So one other thing we did is we actually also built a new algorithm into the software where we're basically telling the sonde, you're collecting EXO data, I want you to use the old 6 series algorithms and make my EXO data look like my old 6 series data. So that's a new capability now that has been built into core software, and that release of software will drop in June.
So that'll ensure maximum consistency between those coming from 6 series and moving into the EXO platform.
It will really help people transition off of the 6 series onto EXO, which is something folks really need to consider, because the 6 series platform, it's got to be one of the most successful products in YSI's history, maybe the most successful in YSI's history. Actually, though, I think the EXO is surpassing it already, even though it's only been around for 6 years. But those 6 series sondes some of them are 20 years old or older now, and we simply can't build them. We can't even get parts for some of them anymore. So it's going to get harder and harder for us to keep supporting those. And so if this has been a barrier for you to being able to go in the direction of EXO, that barrier should now be removed with these new software changes.
Yeah, absolutely. We're very excited about that new software update. We had another comment or question come in. Looks like somebody's asking, is that all the parameters?
Or just algae. Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because someday I'd like it to be all the parameters. So I was just describing that in the core software, we just built a new module that will allow you to measure relative fluorescence units and then measure cells per mil in the laboratory and build your own correlation so that your algae sensor will deliver cells per mil data. That similar approach is actually already available for a parameter we've had for ages, and that's turbidity. A lot of people, rather than reading turbidity in FNU, they prefer total suspended solids, or TSS. similar to what we just talked about for algae, TSS is very environment dependent. So you can build that kind of relationship between turbidity FNU and TSS for the turbidity sensor. I actually have been pondering, and I know we've discussed it a lot, whether we should open that up to all sensors. You know, maybe you want to build your own correlations between dissolved oxygen in 2 different units. Maybe you want to build a correlation between pH and something completely different that you're measuring in the laboratory. Maybe you're using one of these parameters as a surrogate measurement for something else. So we've considered doing that. We've considered whether we should make that kind of a flexible correlation unit available in all of the parameters. And in fact, if any of you watching have ideas for parameters that you would like to see us do that for, let us know.
Let us know. Comment. Feel free to comment right now and let us know what you think about that. If that's something you think we should pursue, definitely feel free to comment. So right now we're still at about 10 viewers, and for those of us that might be just joining us, we are doing a live Facebook Q&A session here, just following up on our algae webinar. You were talking about RFU, and Adam was asking, you know, what is RFU exactly, and how does that relate to algae concentrations? And I know I've gotten this question many, many times before. The RFU unit, and what is that? How does it relate to algae? So, do you just want to comment on that again?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for that question. So, an RFU is a relative fluorescent unit, and really what it is it's the scale of power output, if you will, of the sensor. So it's a 0 to 100% scale. So an RFU of 10 means that what that sensor can detect, 10% of that sensor's detection range, if you will, is being tweaked by whatever's coming back to that detector. RFU, in my opinion, is actually the best unit to use for algae monitoring. Frankly, I think it's the best unit to use for a lot of things.
And maybe we should just let our viewers know that currently, right now, you can get your algae data in micrograms per liter or RFU.
Right.
So.
Right. And an RFU to me is a very unbiased unit. And I think it's the most appropriate unit for monitoring, Zach, because it doesn't lead people to believe that, you know, if you're getting ppb or cells per mil like we just talked, that it's an absolute measurement. Because really, you know, when you're doing monitoring, you're measuring relative relationships. You're measuring changes from a baseline. And I think the RFU is the best unit for really understanding that and for seeing those changes from a baseline.
So what you're saying is those micrograms per liter readings may not actually be the true micrograms per liter readings if someone were to pull a sample and send it to a lab?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And in fact, I just had a call yesterday with some folks in Florida who, you know, they were struggling because they were collecting samples. They were measuring micrograms per liter with the sensor, but then when they were doing their EPA method extractions and measuring micrograms per liter in the lab, these things weren't lining up real well. Sometimes they line up great, sometimes they don't line up at all. And as I explained to them, there are a lot of reasons for that. Again, when we built those relationships, it was with a uni-algal culture in a laboratory. And the other thing you have to remember is that RFU is an in situ measurement. You're measuring pigment fluorescence from pigments that are bound in membranes in cells in water. Parts per billion that you measure in the laboratory extraction is typically an acetone extract of a group of cells. Those things can cause differences, and the level of those differences can really vary widely. So it can be a little tricky, you know, those units work great for some systems, not as great for others. And in the webinar we did a couple of weeks ago, I talk about how, you might want to check whether those units are a really good tool for your system.
Actually, this might be a good opportunity. Why don't you let the viewers know where they might be able to find that webinar if they want to go back and watch it, if they didn't catch it the first time?
Thank you. Yeah, so we have the webinar that we did on April 26th, which is called Are You Ready? And the question is, are you ready for HAB season? Are you ready to do your monitoring? You can find that webinar in at least a couple of places that I know of right now. You can go to ysi.com and you can find that webinar. I think it's on our blog page right now. The other place is YSI has a YouTube channel, and you can find the webinar and you can watch the whole webinar on our YouTube channel. We also have put the slides on SlideShare. So there are a number of places that you can get those slides, and I'm really proud of that webinar. Our team did a really great job on it. A lot of work went into it, and I hope the folks watching will get some of the benefit of that.
Yeah, let me just I'm gonna give a shout out right now to Cyano Tracker. Just submitted a comment saying great information. So thank you, Cyano Tracker. We appreciate that very much.
Yep.
So. And any of you else out there watching, feel free to comment and let us know if you have any questions or comments about algae or algae sensing technology. We're here to help. One question that came in advance, but I think I'll ask it anyway. Michelle asks, does fluorescence change with the time of day of measurement, that the measurement is made?
That's a really good question, and the answer is sometimes yes, but it's not necessarily just because of the time of day. So, fluorescence is sort of an absolute thing. A pigment will fluoresce when it's excited by the right wavelength of light, whether it's night or day. But where you'll start seeing changes, one of the other things that changes from night to day typically is temperature, right? The temperature sometimes drops at night. It's an absolute thing of physics that fluorescence is actually inversely proportional to temperature. So when temperature drops, fluorescence can increase, intrinsic fluorescence can increase. And this is one of the reasons that I sometimes advise people who are working in really warm temperatures or really cold temperatures that they should calibrate their sensors at those temperatures using a water bath, because they'll get a tighter measurement of fluorescence in those environments. So intrinsic fluorescence doesn't change, but the temperature can change, which can have an indirect effect. The other thing that can change is the algae themselves. So pigments are not in static concentrations in algae. They're constantly turning over at the cellular physiology level. So from day to night, the algae are changing their pigment content and pigment types. So you can see differences in your RFUs that could be just due to those changes in pigment concentration per algae cell, even though you might have the same amount of algae cells. So it's kind of an interesting little quirk of algae.
Yeah. So looks like we got a couple more comments coming in, which is great. We really appreciate that. Shout out to Austin Hoffman, who asks, or says, I commonly see anywhere from 20 to 300% difference between a total algae probe deployed in the field for a month and a freshly calibrated one when we ran side by side in the field environment on different sondes. However, the levels are only, let's scroll down. However, the levels are only about 2 micrograms per liter, so even a 0.5 difference is huge. Is it normal when dealing with such low levels?
And the answer is yes. So this is a really important question, and I want to thank Austin for sending that in, because it's often a point of confusion for folks. So earlier in our conversation, we talked about the relative fluorescent unit and how it's a 0 to 100% scale. And so when you're working at those really low scales, he's talking about 2 micrograms per liter. Well, on the chlorophyll channel, that's only 2% or 2 RFUs. So when you're dealing down in that really low range, if you go from 1 to 3, that's a 300% change, right? So that 300% change is not really that big of a deal in the algae monitoring world. So sometimes when you're down there at what I would call your, that's pretty much your baseline, it looks like you have big fluctuations, but those aren't big fluctuations. When you're looking for changes during a bloom situation, you're looking for big changes. And you have to sometimes monitor for many months before you really understand what those big changes would look like in your system. So for example, we have customers who their system is just always kind of teetering along like between 8 and 15 RFUs or parts per billion if that's the unit you're using, which is a microgram per liter. They're just always teetering along between 8 and 15. Now that looks like a twofold difference if you're just monitoring at that low level. But when they get a bloom, that stuff really shoots up, 30, 40, 50. They see a real spike in that. And of course that spike depends on the types of algae and which pigment channel.
Yeah, I think that's one thing important to distinguish, because I remember hearing you speak before saying depending on the type of algae, you might not see that huge spike or increase. Is that correct?
Yeah, it depends on the type of algae. So we see, for example, chlorophyll levels kind of tend to be a little more stable, and if you get a blue-green algae bloom, chlorophyll will go up, but generally it won't go up as much as phycocyanin will, for example, in a Microcystis aeruginosa bloom. So Austin, the short answer to your question is, yeah, I think if I understand correctly what you're saying there, and you're welcome to contact us later if I'm not, but what you're seeing there is not uncommon, and it sounds to me like you're not really yet monitoring in a situation where you would see what a real big fluctuation would look like in a bloom situation.
Great. Thank you for that wonderful explanation, Stephanie. I appreciate that. I'm sure Austin does too. We have another question in here. Bob asks, why does my total algae sensor show negative values? And I also see this sometimes with my turbidity sensor.
Yeah, you might see it with some of your other optical sensors, and the reason, 9 times out of 10, the reason we see that is because during calibration, either the sensor face wasn't clean, or there could be something in the calibration cup that's not clean, or the water's not distilled water that's completely clean. So basically, when you're doing your 0-point calibration in water with any optical sensor, if you're doing a 0-point calibration and that water is not really clean, and I will say DO is probably the exception to this, basically what you're doing is you're telling the sensor that this water, which actually has something dissolved in it, is 0. And then if you end up putting that sensor in water that is cleaner than what you calibrated in, it's going to look negative relative to that calibration point. So we see that a lot with turbidity. It's not uncommon at all. And I know Zach has worked with SONS for years and has probably seen that.
Yeah, it was a common issue for sure, and probably continues to be. When you're calibrating or doing a 2-point calibration, starting off with a 0 standard, either a 0 standard or distilled or deionized water, if you have a little bit of contamination in that water for your first point, that can artificially raise your readings out or during the calibration, meaning if you're monitoring in a very pure water, clear water environment, actually might be clearer than what you used as your zero standard. So that's when you would see negative readings in the field. It's also very important. I'll go ahead and take a moment just to talk about sensor maintenance and sonde care. When you are calibrating not just algae sensors, but really any of these water quality sensors, it's extremely important to the best of your ability, kind of sterilize these calibration cups, and also make sure the sensors are clean. If you go out and sample every day and you're bringing it back to the office or lab, if you're not rinsing these sensors off or washing them off and let them sit overnight, next day you calibrate in the morning, that has some gunk on there, will certainly affect your calibration. I know a lot of people already know this, but a lot of people don't, and they think they can just put their sensors in the calibration solutions. They should be good to go. So it's very important, to keep best laboratory practices when you are calibrating these sensors, because that's the whole point of calibrating. And if you have a skewed calibration, you'll certainly see those effects in the field when you are monitoring for algae and just about every water quality parameter. So yeah. Let's see if we have any new comments here.
I think so we've been really happy to be with you all today for about 30 minutes here. I think probably we've got most people's questions answered by this point.
Yeah, I don't see any new comments.
Yeah, so I want to take a moment to thank everybody for joining us. And I also want to mention that we've really enjoyed doing these algae webinars. I'd like to hear from you if there are other things related to algae that you would like to hear us talk more about. So for example, I talked to a colleague today on the West Coast. Our YSI is part of an organization called Xylem, and we have some really great water treatment options that can help people battle harmful algal blooms if they work with source waters, for example. So, if that's something you would like to learn more about, we could use that as a topic for a webinar. And the other thing I'd like to just put out there is, Zach and a number of folks here at YSI have very deep expertise on the other parameters. So if you'd like to see us do a webinar on one of those other parameters, we hope you'll let us know.
Yeah, and also let us know, if you watch this event or have been watching, is this valuable to you? Do you think we should do more of these Facebook Live events? We're still pretty new at this, and we have some, technical challenges yet to overcome. But we just want to get your feedback on if you think this has been very worthwhile. So please comment and let us know.
All right, I think that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us, and I
Thank
want
you.
to thank our YSI team for helping us do this broadcast. Everybody have a good afternoon.